Dear our guest, let's start.
Yes, we are ready.
So first of all, quick introduction to who is talking. As you can tell by my accent, I'm originally from Germany. I left Germany though in 2000. Before that, I was general counsel for one of the early internet service providers, and we were lucky enough to sell our company at the beginning of 2000 before Nasdaq hit its all-time high. So I retired from the law. I was then of years at the time, and I moved to Southern California to join a technology venture investment firm. And so have been in technology investing more or less ever since. For the past 4 years, we've been exclusively focusing on the blockchain space. And we've also been running the Ethereum meetup groups around Orange County here. Initially, when we started out 4 or 5 years ago, we had 6 people show up. And now we have 1,700 members across our various groups here. And so what I'm telling you right now is basically the state of blockchain as we see it. So from a technology perspective, but then maybe more importantly as a technology investor. And someone in the front row is making signs. It's so awkward if you don't get any feedback. I'm used to talking in front of crowds every other week. So when I don't get feedback, I get kind of nervous. So awesome. Whenever you want to clap, shout, do whatever you need to do, and I'll see if I can answer. All right, so moving on a little bit from there. So there's a lot of confusion, in my opinion, in this market space. A lot of time, people use this term blockchain technology, and really, if you think about this, blockchain in a narrow sense is really just a fancy way of encrypting things, right? And so blockchain technology really just refers to that. But so a lot of times you hear in this particular space the term blockchain technology, and a lot of times it's being used by kind of the incumbents, so the Microsoft, the Bank of Americas of the world, the JP Morgan Chases. And really, in my opinion, what blockchain technology refers to is simply a way of fancy encryption, right? You hash data in a consecutive manner in little blocks or larger blocks, but that's actually not what the Bitcoin white paper actually explained. Not that the Bitcoin white paper actually mentions the term blockchain at all, but neither did Tim Berners-Lee's initial paper where he actually described the internet. He never mentions the word internet, that came later, but clearly what he described in his paper on information management was actually the internet. So what the Bitcoin white paper presents is the blockchain. And we have to think of it really as a decentralized network that creates immutable records. The last option is the most important option, because to me, what blockchain stacks allow, it allows to build value transfer protocols. What do I mean by that? When we started out building the internet, we developed protocols such as the internet protocol, we created file transfer protocols and so forth. And then we developed more sophisticated protocols like simple mail protocol. So SMTP released us from the need to actually write letters, put them into a mailbox, and relieved a lot of friction to the extent where today people send more email on a daily basis than we send snail mail, written letters, over the entire lifetime of the postal services of the world. In that same fashion, things like voice over IP reduced the need for people to pay for metered services. So now most of you guys have a smartphone in their pocket and you pay a flat fee per month, whereas before you would have to pay for this particular call that I'm doing for free, more or less right now, by the minute, and pay a lot of money. So what Bitcoin introduced is an example of money over IP. And we haven't quite got there yet, and it has a lot of implications on what needs to be still be developed in the future from our perspective. I'll explain this in more detail. But in the next step, what we expect to see is not only money over IP, but things like asset over IP protocols. So protocols that will allow the transfer of real-world assets, let's say houses, cars, other assets, directly peer-to-peer, and that's really the main value of what blockchain paradigms provide. It's a paradigm, it's not just the technology. If you're just focusing on the technology aspect, you're missing the most important things. And then for a lot of applications, what we need to fix and what we have botched for the most part is identity. Identity is differentiated based on the fact whether or not you're in the developed nations, and if you're in the developed nations, there's a large chance that your identity has been corrupted by a third party because of the way we have been managing it thus far. JP Morgan Chase had just another 70-some million account data information stolen because the way that information was stored in the past, as you know, has mostly led to a lot of honeypots, and there's many, many examples for that. But then on the other side, there's a lot of people right now that don't have identification. There's more than 1 billion people in the world that do not have identification documents. And that's something that we need to fix in order for those people to be able to actually participate in modern economics. So one last thing in terms of definitions. So as I mentioned, what we really need to do is advance protocols. Right now, there's only a few protocols that are actually implemented on mainnet. So mainly in terms of Ethereum, the ERC20, which has led to a lot of the ICOs that we have been seeing. More than half of those are based on this particular standard. And then another advancement, the ERC721, so the non-fungible token standard, and I'll go into more details on that later. But the main advantage of having protocols on the mainnet is that you have an ecosystem. The ecosystem is comprised of things like wallets, things like exchanges, and these exchanges use those particular standards to the extent that you can transfer value, you can transfer a token, either fungible or non-fungible token, directly peer-to-peer, and you can build other applications that do not need the involvement of a third party. So a lot of times you'll see now people using this term protocol in a different way. And I see this every day where people say, hey, we developed this new protocol for security tokens. We developed this new protocol to exchange some form of value. And in the context of blockchain, this is mostly wrong. What I mean by that is they're referring to a protocol or actually more or less just a particular system of storing data that's just persistent on their sidechain. So what that means is you're taking away most of the facets that are valuable about blockchain, mainly the peer-to-peer aspect, because in order for you to transfer the value or transfer the function, this particular entry in the blockchain actually has to phone back to that sidechain, which is really, at that point in time, just a database on Anchor, but it doesn't allow you to actually transfer these particular values peer-to-peer. And then moreover, because a lot of these particular startups are really in their infancies, there's a 50% chance, at least probably more 90% chance, that these side chains, these databases will eventually go away. So you should think very hard whether or not you should associate any assets to that, and or if you want to rely on the function of this particular side chain. So one thing that obviously is on everybody's mind a lot over the past 2 years at least is this term cryptocurrencies. And I take a lot of offense with this asset. So cryptocurrencies are a very old topic. They were initially invented in 1998 and have seen the ups and downs. And so a lot of these assets that you see today listed on CoinMarketCap do not fulfill the classification of a currency. What do I mean by that? The main thing that Bitcoin introduced outside of peer-to-peer protocols was the separation from money and currency. Currency is the technology of money. Currency enables you to exchange value. But for the most part, these particular assets that are being created have not been created for this particular purpose. So if you look at Ethereum as the prime example and you look at the definition, it has a lot of different implications. It's the fuel that you need to run an application on top of Ethereum, but it also has a protective mechanism so that the network is not under constant DDoS attacks and so forth. But more importantly, you actually probably don't need more than one cryptocurrency. What do I mean by that? What we need is money over IP, like I indicated earlier in my outline. So you can transfer Ether using the Bitcoin blockchain. You can transfer Bitcoin using Ethereum, right? And if you want to look at one particular primary application for that, it's Arbor. It's completely built on the Bitcoin blockchain. So from that perspective, cryptocurrency is not a useful term to describe most of the assets that are listed on exchanges right now. And I would encourage you to find more useful classifications, and I wrote an article to that extent on Forbes.com recently. I pointed out in whatever notes we can disseminate later. So what's money? Money on one hand is a mechanism of exchange, and you're looking at a bearer instrument here. Bearer instrument is simply something that I can give you, and simply by the virtue that I give it to you, I don't have it anymore. And Bitcoin specifically created this in the digital world. It's a digital bearer instrument. And obviously, as you all know, you can just print it out and hand someone this particular entry for their private key and exchange value as well this way if you wanted to. So what currency solves is what I call the cow problem. The cow problem is the coincidence of one's problem. So before there were commodity monies or other monies, what you had to do, you had to exchange barter, although it's probably disputed because a lot of evidence is there that the actual form of money initially was there. But let's go with this particular paradigm. So if you solve that coincidence of one's problem, then the money problem is really secondary, and you realize that money is really a language. So you need to solve the language problem. You don't solve it by introducing a new language, and that's what cryptocurrencies for the most part are trying to do right now. So that I find it very misguided when I see an announcement that I saw last week again, where people say, hey, now you can buy Starbucks with Bitcoin. I don't think anybody in the audience would ever suggest us doing that, right? So for multiple reasons. Bitcoin is mostly a store of value at this point in time for a lot of people that treat it as virtual gold. And that's mainly due to the limitations, mainly due to the fact that whoever Satoshi was decided he's going to limit the issuance to a total of 21 million Satoshis or 21 million Bitcoin in total. So money is language, right? So you don't want to try to introduce a new language to people. So you won't ever see this. You won't ever see a Bitcoin price or an Ether price on your banana, on your bicycle, on your car, right? That is something very unreasonable to expect, in my opinion. So what's needed is money over IP. How do you create money over IP? One step towards that was introduced with this concept of what we call now stable coins. It's a very poor wording for the most part, because a lot of these quote-unquote stable coins are actually pegs. They are pegged to some form of fiat currency. They're pegged to the US dollar in the case of USDC and so forth. But there will be some form of stablecoin coming up next year, and there's a couple of developments underway. So what does this mean? It has a lot of implications for the real world. So what I'm trying to show you here is there's an enormous amount of money that's being transferred from one country to another. The whole remittance space is billions of dollars each year, and there are a lot of parasites in the system that take money out of the system from the poorest of the world. So if you think of the 150,000 Western Union stations in the world that charge $25 or more sometimes to transfer the equivalent of what's $100 from the US to the Philippines or to Mexico. That should not happen. So, but instead, what we'll see next year is things like reverse, I call them reverse ATMs, where you feed fiat currency, so cash, into a machine on one hand, and the recipient on the other hand in Peru, in Mexico, in Spain, in the Philippines can take out cash on their end. They don't have to know what we use in between to transfer that. They don't have to know whether or not you use Bitcoin or Ether or some form of stablecoin. So we're using money over IP. The protocol starts to be hidden into a level where people don't actually have to interact with it anymore. They don't have to install MetaMask. They don't have to buy a cryptocurrency. That's something very unreasonable to expect. A lot of talk has been around this topic of layer 2. As most people know, Bitcoin and the other blockchains only support so many transactions right now, although it's somewhat of an unfair comparison in my opinion, because after 10 minutes you typically get settlement from the Bitcoin network, which is obviously not the case if you transact using any of the banking systems or if you use Visa. You're lucky to get settlement within 24 hours, and if you transact internationally, you're lucky to get settlement within 5 to 7 days, if at all. So to that extent, though, layer 2 solutions, and this shows Bitcoin Lightning Network, and that's based on an Arduino that you can buy in a box. So you will see those solutions being embedded most likely in point-of-sale systems. So we made one example in our recent meetup that we have locally here on this whole topic on non-fungible tokens. So non-fungible tokens, in our opinion for the time being, is one of the most interesting applications outside of the first fungible token. So if you look at it this way, if you're looking at a blockchain and you create an entry and I'm symbolizing it here by QR code, then you can do something in the real world that's pretty interesting, i.e. you can assign this particular blockchain entry to something like a wine bottle, and then you can transact this particular entry on, let's say, the Ethereum network, and just move that particular right to the bottle to the next person using a public blockchain. But then, more importantly, I think, over time what we'll see is these mesh-up or these connections in between different blockchains. So as most of you guys will recognize, this is the IOTA blockchain, which is particularly interesting for IoT solutions. So you could hand over this particular non-fungible token to the next blockchain, and i.e. track the temperature that this wine bottle is being exposed to on the IOTA blockchain and write it back to the 721 entry, and then let's say move it over to a Stellar blockchain that interacts on a point of sale system, and eventually maybe build an application on EOS.io, on EOS, and then transfer this to the consumer. So once you open your app as a consumer, you can look back and you see that this particular entry on the blockchain resembled this particular bottle. In my app, I open it up and I can see how this particular real-world item was treated along its origination all the way to the time it's been moved from the POS system into my shopping cart and into the app on my phone. Users as products. I wrote an article with this title about 10 years ago, and no one thought it was important whatsoever. Today, it's mostly an accepted fact that internet users are treated as products by companies such as Google and Facebook. And what happened is they took most of the value that comes with that, right? You don't own your identity online. Google and Facebook own your online identity and sell it to the highest bidder. So we hope to solve that, and there's, as you guys know, a lot of movement, specifically in the European Union with GDPR, in order to protect everybody's identity, and California just put out a similar regulation here. And what this will do is it will enable more efficient online identity management, and then eventually lead to situations where all of these peer-to-peer systems that are touted right now actually will become peer-to-peer systems. Because if you look at things like the sharing economy, most of the sharing is actually done by users with those particular apps, and they capture most of the value. So most of the value is being created by multi-billion-dollar companies such as Uber and Airbnb, but the sharing economy really meant to introduce peer-to-peer system. Which brings me to an overview of how money has been allocated to these different sectors. So to me, this, as a VC, this is sort of crowdsourcing intelligence. Hey, where did people actually allocate their money? So a lot of money that was raised through initial coin offerings, quote unquote, terrible term, but let's call it that, went into infrastructure. So what do we mean by that? So the initial blockchain infrastructure, blockchain development, into finance application, trading, investment, communication is somewhat skewed. It's mainly the Telegram, ICO, payments. So those are all more or less indications of how near-term applications will be developed, because this is where a lot of the money went. And then maybe as one side note, we spend a lot of time analyzing the actual money flows in those ICOs. And about 60% of money that was actually allocated was allocated by venture capital firms, and they went to the top 20 projects, right? And a lot of times when you read these announcements of how much money these particular companies raise, it's often misguided, because most of the time it's obviously not fiat currencies that they raise, but it's being reported as fiat currencies. So you should be very suspicious about the numbers that you find online. Oftentimes they're self-reported, most of the time they're simply wrong. But it's a good indication overall what you will see being developed over the next 24 months. So where does this lead us, right? We use a very scientific approach to venture allocation. And if you've been around the space for some time, you have seen a variation of this particular graphic. It's typically referred to as protocol. I made some adjustments to that because when this particular graphic first came out, it actually said value capture versus what I call value transfer on here, because the initial implication that was being made by this particular VC in the Bay Area was, hey, in the past, a lot of these centralized organizations, such as Google and Facebook, captured all the value, which is just true. But in the future, these particular protocols, like blockchain protocols, Ethereum and EOS.io and Stellar and so forth, will capture the value. That's utterly misguided. Obviously, for the most part, these particular protocols are open source. Everybody that's sitting in the room right now can grab the source code of Bitcoin and run a node and deviate from its current implementation and so forth. So there's no inherent value. There's some inherent value on what we call blockchain native assets, and there's very far and few in between at the moment. What do we mean by that? Bitcoin with a lowercase b, it's a huge pet peeve of mine when people spell Bitcoin indiscretionary with an uppercase and lowercase b. Uppercase b denotes the blockchain, lowercase b, it's the organic asset of the Bitcoin blockchain. Same with, like, people can buy Ethereum, right? You can only buy Ether, and people say they're buying Ethereum all day long, you can buy it. But the larger point here, there's very few blockchain-based assets. Bitcoin, lowercase b being one of them, ERC 721 being, so CryptoKitty as the typical example being another one, but there's very few other ones. So this whole topic that people are mentioning all day long of tokenizing assets, it's really a poor metaphor for something. Because obviously you cannot actually tokenize a house. You can only tokenize the transfer mechanism. And that's a very important concept to understand. A token in the concept of blockchain is the peer-to-peer element that's being transferred within the blockchain stack. So any other thing is not a token. If you can't transfer it peer-to-peer, it is not a token. So, but back to what is the paradigm shift here? The paradigm shift is, yes, we had centralized companies that were sitting in between what should be peer-to-peer transactions, like the JP Morgan Chases of the world, who are worth $300 billion. And they don't actually provide any type of what we call economic activity. They are rent-seeking middlemen. And blockchain-based systems are the enemy, the arch enemy of the rent-seeking middleman. So these guys, like the Western Unions, the Morgan Chase, the JP Morgan Chases of the world, they are in the crosshairs of blockchain-based systems. And then the other one is Google for a different reason, and that's because of decentralization. And I pointed out in much more detail at a later point in time, the other one being Facebook, and both of them are actually now basically selling your identity for the most part. And then there are other things such as Uber that we pointed out in Airbnb. They are also rent-seeking middlemen, and there will be other applications that will get rid of those. But more importantly, keep in mind, blockchain systems allow you to build value transfer protocols. So there's two main paradigms you need to understand. The value is in creating on-ramps for these value transfer protocols. That's where you capture value. The other value is in actual blockchain native assets. But there are very few, and they're very hard to create, as you can see with the case of Bitcoin, and that's why CryptoKitties was such a big deal. So a few words to often discussed topic that I actually think is a total non sequitur and doesn't need to be discussed at all. What do I mean by that? If you're looking at the United States and the world, there's a lot of discussion about the legal status of what are cryptocurrencies and what are blockchains. And all of those are entirely irrelevant. What I mean. So Bitcoin, according to the IRS here, is a commodity, but then it's taxed as a property, and FinCEN, our financial crimes enforcement network, thinks that all virtual currencies should be treated as money, so that has all sorts of license requirements associated with that. And then the International Monetary Fund has a different opinion. And if you start looking around the world, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions, and they're all missing the main point. The main point being none, not one of these particular agencies obviously regulate technology. Every single one of these regulatory agencies only regulate their citizens. They get to regulate you, they get to regulate legal citizens, legal entities within their jurisdiction. So what's happening is with any technology or with any thing that's actually producing something of value, you're only creating regulatory arbitrage at best. And that's what we saw over the past 12 months, to where people just pick the right legal vehicle, obviously, in order to implement their particular technology using some form of blockchain. And now, as you guys probably saw, we've got blockchain in space. So how do you want to address this as a nation state? It's utterly misguided. The best you can hope for is that you push innovation out of your particular jurisdiction, and we have decades of evidence that this is happening. Google, as one prime example, is paying a fraction of their revenues in the United States because they have a very complex legal setup to avoid paying taxes in the United States, where they remove their revenues around the world 4 times before it eventually gets taxed. And that's the direct effect of taxation and regulation in this particular country, to the detriment of California in this particular case, where Google technically is headquartered. Anyway, so then there's a couple of utterly misguided movements in state laws, particularly New York BIT license. It just shows that those particular regulators do not understand technology. There's more enlightened ones. I don't want to talk about all of those. Most of those actually don't matter. It's mostly important that you implement the right legal vehicle for your technology, and that for the most part in the future will be decentralized autonomous organizations. So what do I mean by that? Bitcoin introduced this other concept that's mostly overlooked in my opinion. We got this failed concept of the DAO, and I'm really, really upset with my guys in Germany that they called it the DAO, not only because it failed, but the DAO is a much larger concept. So what do I mean by that? Right now, we got this entirely absurd concept of for-profit corporations. So for-profit corporations have a lot of internal conflicts. So first you start with an operator, but operators typically have different objectives than employees. Employees typically want to work the least and make the most money. And then you got your clients that simply want the best products. But if I'm a restaurant, delivering you the best product is probably not going to lead me to buy organic food that has been ethically farmed and is free of any type of preservatives. No, because that's going to cut into my bottom line. I'm a for-profit company, so I buy the food that actually lasts the longest, then I have the least spoilage and so forth. And then you got suppliers that also need to make their profits. You got shareholders that might maybe not even care what your company does, as long as you get the most amount of dividends. And then you get governments that are trying to also then interfere with companies' setup and charge them taxes in their local jurisdiction, and charge them other kind of fees that relate to licensing. And licensing, for the most part, is just a restriction and protecting the incumbent. So how are DAOs different? DAOs actually do something very important. They align the interests of all members of the system. And where you see this most prominently, in my opinion, is with things like search engines. Today, we do not have a search engine. Google is an advertising company that just happens to maintain something that they call a search engine by accident. None, zero of the results that you are seeing in Google are search results. You're running a query mostly against their advertising index. Most of the energy that this company spends and most of the employees are working to optimizing advertising. optimizing for profit. And obviously they have to. They're not at fault here. They may be at fault in the sense of being intellectually dishonest by calling it a search engine, right? We don't have a search engine. Everybody who's sitting in the room here right now could build a better search engine in a heartbeat by simply filtering out commercial intent. Assign this particular search result to a DAO, this particular engine to a decentralized autonomous organization, apply a couple of filters, and what you get is an actual search engine that's better by several orders of magnitude in a heartbeat. But Google obviously cannot do this. Google's DNA is a for-profit company. So everything that they do is subsequent to this particular paradigm. They are accountable to their shareholders, not most of all to their users. The users is what they are selling to their clients, which are the advertisers. That needs to be solved. And this particular conundrum, that we don't have a search engine, holds true for most verticals that you see today. Most verticals are plagued by this particular paradigm that companies first and foremost need to be a profit, because the people that are involved in this particular ecosystem, their interests are utterly misaligned. All right, I'm going to stop it here. I can talk about all of these topics for an hour, but I want to give you time for questions, because a lot of these concepts we just touched on a surface level.
Cristian, can you hear me?
I can.
Sure. The question is, you manage and present the Sustany Capital. Can you tell us what projects are maintained by Sustany Capital and what's the goal of this fund?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are taking a very scientific approach to investment. So what we do is we form an investment thesis. And so the thesis that we are following right now mostly is that thesis that we will see more and more true money over IP applications. So they can come in form of what we call reverse ATMs. They can come in form of point of sale system. They can come in forms of apps that don't require you to buy a cryptocurrency. And then most importantly, they come in the form of actual stable coins. So the one thing that I hope will die is this idea of quote-unquote fiat money. The idea that we let money be governed by nation states is utterly ridiculous. And we have really deferred to the banks. So most people do not realize that most quote-unquote fiat money today is created by banks. It's dead. It's money for nothing. But we now have, for once, the opportunity to convert all of these debt, all of these fiat money, first into a quote-unquote stable coin, what we call a stable coin now, what I would refer to as a peg, and from a peg to an actual stable coin. Once you have it on this particular level, you would never want to go back to any form of fiat, because you're introducing all the friction that you're seeing right now. You're introducing, again, a rent-seeking middleman, a bank, a POS provider that's attached to Visa, MasterCard, and so forth. So those are the low-hanging fruit. But from there, so money over IP is already digital native for the most part. So they are lower-hanging fruit. From there, though, what you will see is you got more and more asset over IP applications, and this will mostly start with what we call RegTech. This whole idea of what we used to call fintech is a true joke. What I mean by that is the typical examples of fintech are PayPal and Zenefits, and really what these companies are, they're window dressing. They're window dressing to old world financial systems such as ACH and SWIFT systems. So that's why it will still take you days to actually settle anything using these particular window dressing platforms. So those systems are squarely in the way of blockchain-based systems. Focus on those. Get rid of those. They are rent-seeking. They are decentralized. Focus on creating the on-ramps that we need for true money over IP solutions that do not require the user to actually buy a cryptocurrency. 90% of of people in the world will never touch a cryptocurrency, at least not from the perspective of I actively buy one, because they won't have the need. They have money over IP, and they will probably need as many money over IP protocols as we need voice over IP protocols. But then what we will see moving forward, we will build more sophisticated protocols. So this ERC 721, the non-fungible token standard, is a prime example. Not because I can buy PNGs, I can buy graphics that are queued online. But the first implementation that we partnered with right now is a company called Engine Coin, and they're introducing a little more sophisticated standard called the 1155. The 1155 is what I call a limited token standard. So you can create a limited number of non-fungible things. So where this has immediate implications is for something like in-game items. So their particular software allows you to bake in coins into an in-game items and make these items transferable peer-to-peer and use them cross-platform, cross different games that are using particular software development kits. But then more importantly, you will see across supply chains, across point-of-sale systems, the opportunity to actually track those items long-term. Wherever you can build these on-ramps to blockchain, you provide immediate value because you're likely getting rid of 1, 2, 3 middlemen that right now make money in the instance of buying to create the market, to sell your product for you, to do the price finding process. Whereas these markets should be built organically, right? You should be the original seller. If you are the wine manufacturer, you don't have a relationship right now, hardly ever, with your actual consumer. This will be possible with these particular protocols.
And probably the last question. Are you interested in supporting Ukrainian blockchain startups or finding some partnership in Ukraine? Because you know here we have old folks in blockchain business and a lot of newcomers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we invest worldwide. We're obviously not limited to the United States, and honestly, most of applications that are needed are more relevant to the developing nations rather than the developed nations, because most people here actually have functioning financial systems, even though they are rent-seeking. So immediately applications are needed to where those fiat currencies are already failing. The US dollar will eventually fail, right? It's obviously every fiat currency has failed. The average lifetime of a fiat currency was 37 years. But some of the fiat currencies will fail sooner than later. Just look to Argentina and Chile and a lot of sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. So those people, they need functioning payment systems right now, and for the most part turn to those. But you don't solve those by quote-unquote cryptocurrencies. You solve those with something that's actually stable and a true stable currency, but then from there, see where you can build actual identity solutions that are tied to that. What I mean by that is, eventually, over the next probably 2 years, every person on this planet will have some form of smartphone connected to 5G, driven by some provider that serves the entire planet, right? You probably all saw that there's a lot of satellites being launched now that provide 5G internet access. So at that point in time, every person on the planet is capable of buying a $20, $30 Android phone and has a digital wallet. And actually, a person born in the last 5 years in any country in the world will not have a bank account. By the time they're old enough to legally get a bank account, they have been using some form of digital money, blockchain-based digital money for a decade. So to them, converting back to something that's attached to a credit card or a bank account would seem utterly absurd. So it would be seen as absurd as a person today getting a landline, getting a copper-based phone that they plug into the wall. So long story short here, yes, we are interested in anything that's timely. So there's two things you must understand when you're pitching a venture capitalist. So investing is all about timing, right? There's this typical saying in venture capital, you do not want to invest into the first social media startup, you want to invest into the last. And you got to understand what that is. The other thing is, there's a lot of things right now that people build they're utterly untimely. There's a lot of people that are trying to build the next social network and so forth. There's nothing inherently painful about these particular systems for most people. Yeah, I understand the pains, but for most people, they work just fine. So don't create a solution that's looking for a problem. Look for a problem and then opt for that particular solution. And right now, there's lots, and there's lots worldwide to be had. And blockchain is capable of addressing a lot of that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for...
You're very welcome, Andre. Oh, I forgot to say, so what I see in 10 years from now? Yeah, in 10 years from now, I think what we'll see is a lot of what I touched on earlier, that those decentralized autonomous organizations will start to take over sectors such as what we call search right now, what we call social media right now, and will be more and more community driven, to where rent-seeking entities will be pushed to the side. Because it's so easy once you align the interests of users to convince an enormous number of people to switch to your particular service. The reason why Google took over as an example as the dominating search engine now serves more than 90% of all searches on a daily basis is not because they were really early or they had superior technology. Actually, they stole almost all of their technology, and particularly their business model. Most people don't know that. It was something that was invented much earlier. But what they did well was they aligned their users' interests, at least initially. Now that's no longer the case, but initially they actually provided users what they wanted to see. So users felt aligned with this particular topic, so they started just promoting it, right? So Google didn't do any advertising for themselves initially. They just provided a vastly more superior service that integrated most of the users. So that's where things like AdSense are coming from, where a lot of users had an interest in supporting that particular ecosystem. But then also over time, it has a lot of unintended consequences. So now we got this entire extended consequence of what we call search engine optimization, which is just an ecosystem that Google created inadvertently, which is basically for the most part search engine spam, if you think about that. So you can solve all those things using some blockchain-based systems. If you just think of the topic of identity, if I could filter my internet search result for content that was actually created by humans, that would actually have an origin based on a real human, his particular certification and particular identity and the things that he knows and wants to share, you can create results that are better by several orders of magnitude fairly easily. But in the long term, I think this paradigm will have to take over in a lot of different industries, probably more important in the near term, so the next 5 years, in this whole space of RegTech, so regulation tech. Because the one thing that we entirely forgot is that governments, they're not entities for their own purpose. Governments are functions, and they function fairly poorly for the most part right now, right? Most governments are inefficient and they're cluttered. Every law that was invented still exists. Doesn't matter if it makes sense today, it still exists because there's an entity attached to it, and there's people that are working for it. But governments are functions, and most of these functions can readily be taken over by blockchain-based systems. If you think of like one of the most inefficient systems here is something like identity documents or something like the DMD. There's no reason for anybody at this point in time, obviously, to have plastic cards in their wallets. Those plastic cards don't add any additional value. You have identity verification that are inherent to your body, and you should be using those. But then more importantly, all of those criteria, all of those credentials, all of the things that we own, they should be actually associated to your identity. Right now they're associated to governments. So governments pretend they're giving you those rights. It's not true. You have these rights as a human being. You should be able to own these. So in the next 10 years, I expect to see a lot of these rent-seeking entities go away. The more rent-seeking they are, the less they provide inherent utility and provide essential economic activity. You look up that term specifically in the context of currency and money. The more vulnerable they are, and the earlier they should go away. But then the next step is really to get rid of all these offices, so government offices that are occupied by people that are not measured by any form of output, and that you can fairly easily, for the most part, measure and execute using smart contract systems, right? I assume that most people in the room are capable of creating systems, at least in theory, that are more efficient than what most of your government agencies provide to you at the moment.
Thanks, Cristian.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.